So I wonder how I should cut this. I don't even know what to title this recording. I'm checking in on politics in 2024 in South Africa. It certainly is an interesting. The DA remains the only really competent party that's doing anything of note. The DA is the only one that really brings progressive agency into the political arena. All the other players really show themselves up as being quite pathetic. Um, the Freedom Front Plus, which you could say used to have, let's say, some principled stands about, supporting Cape independence, let's just say that could be seen as a principled stand on policy, is now trying to work with the ANC in governments of local unity, saying that the DA does the same thing at the national level, why can't they do the same thing at the local level? I mean, it's just suicide. It's just political suicide. I mean, it's like a rabid flailing of something that doesn't know what it's got a hold of. I mean, the DA is not doing any favor to the ANC by entering into the government of national unity. The DA is there for one reason only, and that is to displace the EFF and the MK parties. It's not. It's If anything, it's not trying to do a favor to the ANC. It's trying to do a favor to the country and to itself by preventing Armageddon, essentially, by preventing a genocide, by preventing a race war. Um, so the DA must obviously use the position that it's in opportunistically to amplify and promote the value of non-racialism and to try and make sure that GNU policy reflects non-racialism. So it has a lot of work to do, and it's fighting against everyone in order to do that, even people that used to be, let's say, useful allies, like the Freedom Front Plus, who's too busy trying to make an alliance with the ANC on a local level to prove what? To try to help to rehabilitate the ANC's image. I mean, it's pathetic. How does this help on a national level to institute the removal of racial regulation like BEE and preferential procurement that is so corrupt and that leads to so much wastage of state resources? So it's all really just a sideshow. Action SA was never a contender. Action SA is a party that exists as an optical illusion as a party. It doesn't really stand for anything principled. It pretends to be of the Rainbow Nation. It pretends to be of the New South Africa. But, when push comes to shove, its rhetoric goes all over the place. Herman Mashaba is a pathetic ideologue. He doesn't stand for anything. He doesn't stand for non-racialism. He will promote, he's basically EFF light half the time on racial issues and racial questions. So, the opposition, apart from the DA, is radically unprincipled and, quite frankly, just a waste of time. To even talk about them is to not be serious. So, I mean, this is perhaps quite a valid bit of, because the DA should be rewarded in the next elections, just in contradistinction to the Action SA and Freedom Front Plus, who are basically committing suicide. So, good for them, making themselves more irrelevant and making themselves more seen as what they are, which is volatile agents, adding nothing to the discussion and adding nothing to trying to make progress on real issues that are really bogging down the nation. So the question really remains then, in what I've tried to talk about here, is, will the DA be forced to compromise on the question of affirmative action, racialized affirmative action? Can the DA remove racialized affirmative action and racialized legislation? Because you must remember that, it's unconstitutional. The law that's on the books is fundamentally unconstitutional. It was never properly tested. It says in the limitations clause that you have to take into account all relevant factors, including A, B, C, D, E, the purpose and extent of the limitation, the reason of the limitation, all those sorts of things. That was never done. That test in Section 36 was never done. So we've got judges that betray the Constitution, treacherous judges that have been twisted by racial ideology, and they can't even do their job as judges. And so now we're left with this political mess that has to be politically resolved, which is really backwards. You would really hope that the public protector would do something on this issue, but the public protector can't do anything for anyone that isn't, depending on their shade of skin tone. That's how the public protector works. If your issue relates to people that aren't black, good luck. That's not what they exist for. So, the state has really intrinsically become racialized, and the logic of the racialized legislation is racial scapegoating. We're stuck with racialized scapegoating now as being the moral measurement, the moral validity that the state offers when it makes things law. It has extended that. So, this is why our culture is obsessed with racialized scapegoating. And it's happened, these witch hunts that happen in these schools. And we've got an education minister who does nothing about it, which comes from the DA. So that's very problematic on an optical level. The DA is really, I think, scoring an own goal there. Because, I know, is Saviwe Grootrube, is she too much into identity politics herself? I mean, I can only note that she was in the party when Mmusi Maimane was the leader. So I know it makes one wonder about what her non-racialist credentials really are. Gwen Ngwenya left the party when Mmusi Maimane was the leader because she could not tolerate the racialized legislation and policy that the DA was spouting. And Saviwe now can't even do anything or say anything up about these witch hunts, these racialized witch hunts that occur. She says nothing. So the DA is not off to a good start, because what you would do is you would create some rhetorical pressure at this juncture. What you should be doing is creating rhetorical pressure against the ANC on the issue of non-racialism. You would make some noise about non-racialism and about how the state has betrayed non-racialism and the state is incoherent on the value of non-racialism. And this incoherence is a kind of anti-white racism. It's fashionable right now, and it's gone mainstream. It's in the mainstream media, and obviously that's how it's getting into schools as well. Is because in school, people aren't taught non-racialism like they should be taught colorblind morality. They're not taught that anymore because it's become controversial because of these so-called progressives, which are really just black fascists. So we've normalized black fascism, we've normalized racialized scapegoating, and it's in the law and it needs to stop. If the DA, if someone from the DA was actually a public protector, I would write to the public protector's office and I would ask for a report on non-racialism. So I would love for the public protector to write up a report on non-racialism. What is the status of the constitutional value of non-racialism in the Republic as it stands? And then we can look at the racialist legislation, the media, the bias in the media. The media is so identity politics driven and woke. It's disgusting. It's unconstitutional. It's betrayal of constitutional values. But because the law is incoherent on this issue, it allows everybody else to indulge. So we're in a very sorry state. And really, the key to fixing corruption in this country is the removal of the racialized preferential procurement. Because if you can pick someone based on their race, then you don't have to pick them based on merit or based on what they deliver. And so service delivery costs way too much for the government because it's been racialized. Zondo goes into this at great detail in the Zondo recommendations. So really, the key to solving waste and corruption is to remove the racialized legislation. That's everything. And will the DA compromise on that front? Now, it's very dangerous for the DA not to deliver, I would say, in this on this issue. If it could deliver on this issue, it would go a long way to helping the ANC reform itself and rehabilitating itself to be more morally cleansed, as it were, because this is the moral corruption that conceals state corruption. And so the state would go a long way into fixing itself if the DA could push this button. It might cause the alliance to break down, though, so strategically maybe it can't be pushed. But the DA has to be honest with its own constituency and its own voters. And so if it is going to compromise on being able to deliver on non-racialism, it has to start communicating that, I would say. The importance for Helen Zille to say that this is a coalition, it's not a GNU, it's not a government of national unity, it's a coalition between the DA and the ANC. The point of framing it that way is so that the DA can actually negotiate for policy changes. So I'm very much behind Helen wanting to rebrand the coalition that way so that the DA can start to negotiate on policy, because the policy of the GNU is also the policy of the ANC, is not just the policy of the ANC, it's the policy of the DA at a national level. And there's fundamental incoherence, therefore, in the GNU promulgating and continuing to promulgate racialized legislation. So, look, we have the problem that we're dealing with law that is already on the books, that should have never been accepted. It should have never stayed on the books. It should have been thrown out by the courts, but the courts wouldn't do their job because of ideological capture. Well, maybe it wasn't ideological capture, maybe it was just catered deployment. But you see, the corruption, the moral corruption of rejecting non-racialism is a very thin veneer, it's a very thin smokescreen for state corruption. So, there's obviously a huge impetus to function within the corruption that the state facilitates and allows. And that for that legal avenue to be closed would threaten a lot of patronage networks and how they function. So it's politically, this is the crux of what causes corruption and where it comes from. So I don't know how motivated the DA really is to remove these impediments, because in some sense, if the ANC starts really cleaning up its act, then the DA has less of a contender to fight against. Or it's harder for the DA to prove itself in contradistinction to the to the ANC, if the ANC can really start to clean. But it looks like that the ANC is completely married to racialized legislation. You can see how the president tried to say, oh, look, we have implemented all of Zondo's recommendations. Very cheeky of him to make that statement in his newsletter when he has completely done nothing about the racialized aspect which Zondo talked about as being the reason why the state can't get value for money in its tender contracts, and how this hurts the average citizen that's meant to be receiving on the receiving end of that service delivery. So, we have Zondo's recommendations, which is completely cut through the ideological smokescreen. And people, politically, it has not been pushed enough, I think, from the DA. I think the DA needs to kind of adopt Zondo and repeat it over and over again and link it to racialized legislation being a smokescreen for corruption. Helen Zille makes these links quite often. But I think we need a narrative about, a more defined narrative about how the lack of non-racialism in the state breeds murkiness that facilitates corruption. That the moral corruption is the state corruption. They are the same thing. And the people who promote racialism and racial policy are very clearly in it for maintaining the functioning of corruption, essentially. It's so obvious and elementary, really. It's annoying that more people don't, there's something very sinister about how the SABC and Newsroom Africa and all these African-centric, black-centric intellectual elite operate, the racialism that they adopt. The pro-black agenda, how that's taken for granted. It makes me wonder, because is this as a result of the fact that everyone is an imposter? All these people have received their position under the auspices of quotas, essentially. And so because they owe their own position and they haven't earned it on merit, that they have to give a kind of fealty to the ideology. They have to adopt black consciousness, so sort of you make one imposter, you create a black consciousness acolyte, and then you give these people microphones, and obviously what they say is embarrassing, is morally incoherent and nebulous. And then they get very sensitive around the racial issue, because they essentially have no integrity. And, the kind of institutional integrity, the credentials that they have become susceptible to the same rot and the same decomposition, because they all operate on quotas. And so the only thing that any of these things continue to run is if they go the whole hog into black consciousness and promote black consciousness, and so everything becomes a kind of, you see the propagation of black fascism emerging out of everything, and we see it especially around institutions that are meant to be meritorious, and like academia, has become completely infiltrated by acolytes of black consciousness. And you can see why they attack those institutions is because they're trying to bring down all the gatekeeping, credentialed sources of authority. They're trying to turn all the sources of authority in a society into serving lapdogs which serve their ideological narrative and trumpet their so we live in a compromised society, in a compromised politics, and I don't blame the DA for having to compromise on non-racialism because it's just there to displace the MK and the EFF, but it must be opportunistic. It must at least be seen to be opportunistic in trying to bring non-racialism back into functioning, back into coherence, to bring the constitutional state back, to bring the liberal order back, because it has been lost, it has been betrayed. And it's still a question of how is this going to get unfucked? How is this going to come right? It's very scary.